convalescent plasma. Today, I think we're going to be talking on another very important topic, which is oxygen therapy. And this is an effort जिससे हम ये चाह रहे हैं कि not only centers of excellence, which you all are representing, the various regional centers and state centers of excellence, but through you, every doctor, even in the primary health center or in rural India, is trained and is confident of managing COVID-19 patients. तो इस सारे जो हम वेबिनार्स कर रहे हैं इसका मकसद यही है कि वी develop a strategy of training of trainers which are you are all going to be, and then you will subsequently be able to train in your areas various doctors at primary level, secondary level, tier 2, tier 3 cities, so that there is no ambiguity in the treatment of COVID. और ये मैं चाहूंगा कि वी वर्क ऑन दैट. इन माय माइंड जो आज टॉपिक हम डिस्कस कर रहे हैं ऑक्सीजन थेरेपी, दैट इज वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. I have always been saying this, and I think I would just like to repeat that in my mind, COVID for management of COVID-19, oxygen therapy is more important than ventilators. We will save more lives by providing oxygen than we will by providing high-end ventilators. We have always focused कि ventilators और होने चाहिए, ventilators और होने चाहिए. मेरा ये मानना है कि हमें फोकस करना चाहिए कि ऑक्सीजन इनफ होनी चाहिए, क्योंकि दोज पीपल हु नीड ऑक्सीजन can come out and be all right. But people who have severe lung problem and land up on a ventilator have a high mortality, and many of them do not come out. So I think it's important for us to understand that in the current pandemic, oxygen and proper delivery of oxygen is more important than ventilators. कई दफा लोग ये कहते हैं कि वेंटिलेटर्स हमारे पास ज्यादा होने चाहिए, हमें वेंटिलेटर्स की ट्रेनिंग चाहिए. मैं ये कहना चाहूंगा कि वेंटिलेटर्स की ट्रेनिंग से ज्यादा जरूरी है कि ऑक्सीजन की ट्रेनिंग होनी चाहिए. एंड दैट इज व्हाई आई थिंक दिस webinar on oxygen therapy is very very important. Also, it's important that we look at our oxygen dissociation curve. How does it flatten? What is the actual saturation that you need in a given patient, rather than wasting oxygen? And we know that after when you reach a saturation of 90 or 90 plus, the oxygen dissociation curve is flat. यानी कि उसके बाद बहुत ज़्यादा फायदा नहीं है to really try and push the saturation from 92 to 98, 99. You will actually in many cases be wasting oxygen. Therefore, that's also very important to understand that the sigmoid curve that we have of oxygen dissociation, we don't want to be on the steep part of the curve. लेकिन जब saturation 90, 92 से ऊपर हो जाती है, then we are not achieving anything much by now going from 92 to 99. And we may actually be able to provide oxygen to others and be able to save more rather than pushing for an oxygen saturation of 98, 99. There are other some circumstances where you need to do that, but कुछ circumstances ऐसे भी हैं. We have many of our COPD patients who are doing well on saturation of 88, 90. So we need to also individualize treatment. And therefore, it is very important to conserve oxygen. Also, what we would like to discuss, जो हम आज discuss करना चाहेंगे कि what are devices that we use for oxygen? How do we deliver oxygen? What is the whole issue of oxygen delivery devices? That is something that we have to also understand. Giving oxygen is one, but I think we need to develop that. I personally feel, and we are trying to do that, we have to develop modules of how to use oxygen at a home setting. Many patients are using oxygen at home. I get a telephone call. One patient rang me up 5 days ago. मेरे को सिलेंडर तो ले लिया, मुझे मेरे पास आ गया, लेकिन मुझे पता नहीं इसको खोलना कैसे है. अब मैं गूगल करके ये देख रही हूँ कि सिलेंडर कैसे खोलना है, उसको ऊपर का नॉब को कैसे खोलेंगे, फिर आगे उसको पाइप कैसे लगानी है. So I thought that maybe we should actually make some sort of a video or a module of how do you use an oxygen cylinder at home. Because वो एक दफा खोलेगा तो आधी ऑक्सीजन तो अगर ज्यादा खुल गया वेल्व तो बहुत वेस्ट हो जाएगी. फिर उसके साथ ट्यूबिंग कैसे लगानी है, पानी के अंदर डालना है, ह्यूमिडिफिकेशन. सिलेंडर तो पीपल आर बाइंग, बट उसको यूज कैसे करना है, उसको खोलना कैसे, या रेंच कैसे ऊपर लगाना है, ये दीज आर थिंग्स दैट we no one knows. So I think we have to work on that. We are trying to make a module on this, but I'm trying to tell you that it's important for us to train people when we are talking of primary level, rural level, of the basics also. So high end itne, we're not talking of high end things, I'm talking of very basic things. how to properly use an oxygen cylinder, how to use a face mask, how to use a venti mask, what is a nasal prong, what is a rebreathing mask, and what are the advantages of when should what this be used, when should the other be used. I think that is important. And finally, we must also understand that oxygen, like a drug, also has oxygen toxicity. Giving very high oxygen at 100%, especially when we are using a high flow nasal cannula and giving 100% oxygen, we should keep in mind that over a period of time, you may have features of oxygen toxicity. It can cause atelectasis in the lung. It can have systemic effects both in the eye and other organs. Therefore, we must be aware of oxygen toxicity, because the basic principle in medicine is do no harm. So that is also very, very important. So this is a very important topic, and I'm very happy that we have very senior faculty from the Department of Anesthesia, Critical Care and Pain Management, Dr. Vimi Rewari, who would be talking on oxygen therapy without invasive ventilation. And with me here is another very senior person, Dr. Professor Anjan Trika, who will also be here to really answer your questions at the end of the talk so that we can take any doubts or queries that you have. So now, without wasting much time, or maybe before I ask Dr. Vimi to really start, I'll just ask the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to give a few comments before we start this topic.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Let me at the outset welcome all the colleagues who are present in this webinar today. We have more than 1,100 participants, and we also understand that through Doordarshan it is being widely disseminated. पूरे देश में ये हमारा मैसेज जा रहा है. जैसे कि डॉक्टर साहब ने बताया, आज जरूरी है कि हम कोविड-19 को एक डीमिस्टिफाइड तरीके से देखें. ये बीमारी क्या है, इसके किस टाइप के ट्रीटमेंट ऑप्शंस हैं, और उसमें ऑक्सीजन थेरेपी का क्या रोल है, जिसके बारे में आज हम लोग डिस्कशन करेंगे. जैसे कि डॉक्टर साहब ने मुख्यतः इसमें बताया कि एक तो टाइम पर हमारी थेरेपी शुरू हो, एडुक्वेट थेरेपी हो, ना ज्यादा ना कम, यानी कि जितनी ऑक्सीजन देनी चाहिए उतनी ही दी जाए, उससे ज्यादा भी हार्मफुल हो सकती है. इन प्रिंसिपल्स को अगर हम समझें तो जो आज हम सिचुएशन पा रहे हैं कि कहीं पर हमें ऑक्सीजन की कमी, इस टाइप की सिचुएशन दिखती है, हम उसको ओवरकम कर पाएंगे, और साथ ही ये देख पाएंगे कि जिस पर्टिकुलर पेशेंट को जितनी ऑक्सीजन चाहिए हम उसको प्रोवाइड कर पाएंगे. इसके साथ ही हम एक मुख्य अंश आप लोगों को कहना चाहेंगे कि दिस इज अ सीरीज ऑफ वेबिनार व्हिच एम्स दिल्ली एज नेशनल सेंटर ऑफ एक्सीलेंस इज डूइंग. इससे पहले भी हमने 3 वेबिनार की हैं. आने वाले नेक्स्ट 10 दिनों में भी हम वेबिनार डिफरेंट टॉपिक्स पर करते रहेंगे, चाहे वह एक्सरे हो, चाहे वह सीटी स्कैन हो, टेस्टिंग IL-6 हो, या इसी तरीके के क्या क्या हमारे पास रेमडेसिविर और ऐसी जो हमारी थेरेपी है उनका कैसे उपयोग होना चाहिए. तो हमारी आप सबसे रिक्वेस्ट यही होगी कि इसका अधिक से अधिक लाभ उठाएं. हमारी मेडिकल फ्रेटर्निटी पर्टिकुलरली एट द district and below district level, they need to understand this disease, they need to guide their patients well in time, ताकि हम अर्ली आइडेंटिफिकेशन कर पाएं और हम अपने पेशेंट को क्रिटिकल होने से पहले ही बचा पाएं. धन्यवाद.
Thank you very much. And again, I'll also like to introduce the panelists along with Dr. Anjan Trika. We have Dr. Neeraj Nischal, who was there in the last few webinars also. He'll also be there to answer your questions. And Dr. Rajiv will be the moderator as far as the questions are concerned. So now, without wasting much time, I'll ask Dr. Vimi to start the presentation of oxygen therapy without invasive ventilation.
Thank you, sir. So very good afternoon to everyone. Today I'll be talking about the basic principles of oxygen therapy in patients with COVID-19. And in the next half an hour or so, I will be talking about the basic mechanism of hypoxia in COVID-19, the goals of oxygen therapy, the various types of oxygen delivery systems that are available, the adjunct of wake proning to improve oxygenation in these patients, and methods to conserve oxygen, especially with the prevailing circumstances. So as we all know, oxygen is essential for all metabolic processes in our body, and lack of oxygen or hypoxia can affect vital organ function. And if not treated in time, it can lead to irreversible damage. Hypoxemia is the most common symptom of presentation of patients with COVID-19 disease. In fact, 14% of patients with COVID-19 have severe respiratory disease, out of which 5% will be critically ill and require ICU admission. Severe hypoxemia in these patients is often amenable to oxygen therapy alone or in a combination with non-invasive respiratory strategy. The other important aspect of the respiratory failure in these patients is that, especially in the early phases, often the hypoxemia is not associated with hypercapnia. So these patients are able to move large volumes of air in and out of the lungs. So these patients will not have increased levels of carbon dioxide. A very small subset of these patients will also not present with dyspnea. That means they will have low oxygen saturation, but will not have the subjective feeling of dyspnea, which is given the term happy hypoxemia. So what happens in these patients? What leads to hypoxia? In the early phase of the disease, there is alveolar edema, atelectasis, which leads to intrapulmonary shunting. There can be intravascular microthrombi and loss of lung perfusion regulation. As the disease progresses or if the treatment is not instituted in time, it can lead to the progressive disease to acute respiratory distress syndrome, where there is increased consolidation, atelectasis, increase in dead space, VQ mismatch. There is reduced lung compliance. In the early part of the disease, the lung compliance of the pulmonary mechanics is maintained, but in the later part of the disease, the lung compliance is reduced and there is carbon dioxide retention, anxiety, fatigue. So in the early part of the disease, these patients' hypoxemia is often amenable to, like I said before, oxygen therapy or non-invasive ventilation strategies. But once the patient develops ARDS or severe disease, then often these patients will need invasive mechanical ventilation. The common symptoms of presentation of hypoxemia here are dyspnea, tachypnea, a feeling of tightness in the chest, and the degree of hypoxia can often be measured by looking at the peripheral oxygen saturation using a pulse oximeter. So pulse oximeter is a device which is readily available. It is very easy and quick to use and is not very expensive as well. The gold standard of measuring hypoxia obviously remains the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood, which can be measured using an ABG analyzer. And the other advantage of looking at the PaO2 is to measure the PF ratio, which helps us to categorize the severity of ARDS. If one does not have an ABG analyzer or does not have the facility to measure the PaO2, then one can also look at the SF ratio, which is the ratio of the saturation versus the FiO2, which is very useful. It is non-invasive in nature, and various studies have shown that the SF ratio correlates very well with the PF ratio. Besides these, one also has to look at the signs of increased work of breathing, which means that when the patient is using accessory muscles of respiration, that is, there is flaring of ala nasi, there is use of sternocleidomastoid, there is intercostal muscle retraction or tracheal tug. So one has to look out for all these signs, which means that the disease is worsening, besides the degree of oxygen saturation, of course. So what are the goals of oxygen therapy? The primary goal of oxygen therapy in these patients is to maintain adequate tissue oxygenation. And once you administer oxygen, there is increase in the alveolar levels, which leads to increased blood levels of oxygen, and therefore corrects the acute hypoxemia, brings up the oxygen saturation, and thereby leads to alleviation of the symptoms which are associated with hypoxemia, such as feeling of dyspnea, tachypnea, and improvement in the mental function. In addition, it also helps in decreasing the cardiopulmonary workload. The reduction in sympathetic stimulation leads to decreased load on the left side of the heart. The abolishment of the hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction because of the hypoxia leads to decreased load on the right side of the heart. So what is the primary goal of oxygen therapy? The primary goal of oxygen therapy is to maintain a saturation target, like Professor Guleria already mentioned before, to maintain a target of 92 to 94% only. One should not try to achieve levels more than 94% because it does not give us any advantage, instead leads to problems or disadvantages. So, and wastage of oxygen, which is a precious commodity in today's situation. If the patient is in a monitored, excessive, nicely monitored environment like an intensive care unit, we can even accept a lower saturation of 90 to 92% because we have the facilities to intervene earlier. In patients who have underlying diseases like lung disease, like COPD, we can accept saturation targets of 88 to 90% as well. So the oxygen delivery devices are basically of three types. The most commonly used and widely available are the conventional oxygen therapy devices, which are again of two types, which I'm going to talk about a little later. And then the second type is the high flow nasal oxygenation, which has been widely used in this pandemic. And finally, the non-invasive ventilation. So the conventional oxygen therapy is basically of two types, which depends on the amount of inspired gas flow that it supplies. So we have a high flow system and a low flow system. The high flow system is capable of delivering all the patient's inspired gas requirement, and thereby there is no dilution from the surrounding air and the FiO2 remains stable. That means if you are aiming to deliver an FiO2 of 0.5, the device will deliver a FiO2 of 0.5 or 50% oxygen. In a low flow device, since it delivers a very low flow, the patient draws the remainder of the minute volume from the surrounding environment, and therefore more the minute volume, more the dilution, and lower the FiO2. So the FiO2 is not stable and is dependent on the patient's own mechanics or the total minute volume that the patient requires. So just to clarify what I just said, say a patient has a minute volume of 5 liters per minute. So to satisfy that, if you're giving the patient oxygen flow rate of 2 liters per minute, so 2 liters of 100% oxygen, which is diluted with 3 liters per minute of air, which is drawn into the mask, which actually leads to a 5 liter per minute of minute volume. So when calculate the FiO2, it comes to 0.53%. The same patient, when he or she develops respiratory distress, the minute volume say increases to 30 liters per minute. And with the same oxygen flow rate of 2 liters per minute, now this is diluted with 28 liters of air, which is drawn into the mask. So this FiO2, which was initially 0.53, is now reduced to 0.26%. So you might think that you're delivering a FiO2 0.5, but actually what the patient is getting is 0.26. So that is the main disadvantage of a low flow system, because it is dependent on the patient's minute ventilation. So coming to the first interface, which is the most commonly used in a low flow system, which is a nasal cannula, and it is capable of delivering an FiO2 ranging from 0.24 to 0.44% or 24 to 44% with a flow rate of 1 to 6 liters per minute. So the main advantage of this device is that it is very easy to use. Anybody can use it. It is disposable. It is very low cost. And importantly, it is very well tolerated by the patient, and the patient can eat, drink, cough while the device is in place. So it is comfortable. The only disadvantage of this device is that the flows more than 4 liters per minute can cause drying and crusting of nasal mucosa, which can be a little problematic for the patient. So the next slide just depicts the total flow of oxygen, which gives you the FiO2, desired FiO2. So 1 liter per minute of oxygen flow will give you FiO2 of 24, and every increase in 1 liter increases the FiO2 by 4%. But one must remember, this is based on a normal minute volume. If the patient has excessive minute volume, this will always obviously be less. The next device, which is again very commonly available and used, is a simple face mask, which is also called the Hudson mask. It is very cheap, readily available, and easy to apply. The maximum FiO2 achieved here is 0.6, which can be lower in the presence of respiratory distress. If you keep the oxygen flow less than 4 liters per minute, there might be some rebreathing. That means that you are breathing in your expired air, which can lead to increase in carbon dioxide levels. So coming to the next device, which has been most extensively used in this pandemic, which is called a non-rebreathing reservoir mask, which is a low flow device, which is capable of providing a higher FiO2. So what this is basically a mask which is attached to a reservoir bag with a capacity of about 1 liter. And there is a one-way valve between the mask and the bag, so that the expired gas is unable to enter this reservoir bag. So when the patient breathes in, the valve gives way, and the patient is breathing in almost 0.8 to 0.9% of oxygen through the reservoir bag. So that is why it is set to deliver an FiO2 between 0.8 to 0.95 with an oxygen flow of 10 and 15 liters per minute. So the only thing to remember here when you're using this device is that first, make sure the mask is fitting tightly onto the face so there are no leaks. And second, one should ensure that the reservoir bag is always inflated. So the minimum flow that is required to keep the bag inflated, provided there are no leaks, is 10 liters per minute. So one should ensure that. So this is a device which is capable of delivering a high FiO2, but one should remember that it also uses up a lot of oxygen. So coming next to the fixed performance systems or the high flow systems, where the oxygen delivery is independent of the patient factors. And the prototype of this is a Venturi type mask, which is based on the Venturi principle, that is the oxygen passing through a small orifice or a jet entrains air to a predictable dilution. So the FiO2 is adjusted by changing the Venturi valve and setting the oxygen flow rate. So as you can see in the picture below, the FiO2 is determined by the size of the jet, and this is color coded depending on the FiO2, 24 to 60%. The 24% is blue and 60% is green. So this is for ease of identification. So how does it work? There is a mask which is connected to a Venturi device. And like you can see here, this is a cross section of that Venturi device. So this is a small orifice through which oxygen is passed. And since it is coming out of a smaller orifice, it is at a higher pressure. Because of this high pressure, there is drop of pressure alongside this jet, which leads to entrainment of air. So larger the jet orifice, less the pressure drop, less the entrainment, and therefore higher the FiO2. So after dealing with the conventional oxygen therapy, the next oxygen delivery device that I'm going to be discussing is the high flow nasal oxygenation system, which, like I said, has been widely used in this pandemic and has helped in preventing intubation in a lot of patients. So what this device consists of is a oxygen source or a flow meter, which is connected to a blender, which blends air with oxygen and is capable of delivering a FiO2 ranging from 21% to 100%. So this gas is then passed through a humidifier, which warms and humidifies the gases and passes it through an inspiratory tubing and then delivers it to the patient through a nasal interface, and which consists of very soft and pliable nasal cannulae. So how do you institute this technique? You fit the nasal prongs onto the patient, tighten it, you initiate the maximum flow. The maximum flow can differ from the type of machine. So it ranges from 60 liters to 80 liters. So you start at a maximum of 60 liters. And once you initiate the maximum flow, one should ensure to place a surgical mask over the patient's face, because this is known to generate a lot of aerosols. So putting a mask on the patient's face, a 3-ply surgical mask, will help in reducing the aerosol dispersion. And then the next step is you change the FiO2 as per the saturation level. So you down titrate it and keep the saturation to 92 to 94%. Similarly, for humidification purposes, you start with a higher temperature and come down, because a higher temperature is often uncomfortable to the patient because it's very warm. So you can come down to 34 degrees centigrade. So besides delivering heated, humidified gas, which is capable of delivering a very high flow and a very high FiO2, there are some additional physiological benefits of HFNC as well. That is why it has kind of prevented patients from being intubated and put on invasive mechanical ventilation. So primarily what it does is it flushes the nasopharynx with oxygen, which reduces the dead space and improves the oxygenation. Also, the high flow produces a very high expiratory impedance, which generates an extrinsic PEEP of about 4 to 6 centimeters, depending on the flow that is kept. And this results in a lower respiratory rate and a reduction in work of breathing. Also, the heating and the humidification of gases helps in preservation of the mucociliary function. And this is useful for effective clearance of respiratory secretions. So it has a lot of advantages. But the important thing here is when you put the patient on HFNC, one needs to monitor these patients carefully. And these 3 things that need to be monitored are the saturation, the respiratory rate, and the breathing pattern for any increase in work of breathing. And one of the parameters which you can look at for monitoring the efficacy of HFNC is the ROX index, which is the ratio of saturation by FiO2, which is divided by the respiratory rate. And it has been shown that a ROX index of less than 3.85 at 12 hours is a good predictor of HFNC failure. So like I said before, the only hazard of instituting HFNC is that if you do not monitor these patients properly, they can be delay in recognizing complications, delay in instituting mechanical ventilations if you're not looking at the saturation, the respiratory rate, the ABG parameters, and these patients can often land up in respiratory problems if they are not properly monitored. Otherwise, all in all, it has a lot of advantages. So next we come to the non-invasive ventilation, which is actually generation of positive pressure in the airways using a standalone machine or using wall CPAP machines. And this is which is delivered through various interfaces. I'll be talking about the interfaces a little later. And this is primarily of 2 types without going into the technical details. One is CPAP and the other is BiPAP. CPAP is a continuous positive airway pressure throughout the respiratory cycle. It remains the same throughout the respiratory cycle, both inspiration as well as expiration. Whereas in BiPAP, which stands for a bi-level positive airway pressure, consists of different pressures during inspiration and expiration. There are varying levels of positive pressure. So EPAP is the expiratory positive airway pressure, and what it does is basically similar to PEEP. It keeps the alveoli inflated, so which increases it kind of inflates the atelectic alveoli, increases the lung volume and the FRC, which helps in improved alveolar gas exchange and thereby the oxygenation. Then IPAP is the inspiratory positive airway pressure. In other words, some people also know it as pressure support. It kind of augments the inspiratory effort and helps in improving the tidal volume, which leads to improved clearance of carbon dioxide. And this is why it is especially important in patients who have underlying hypercapnia or patients who have COPD. It also helps in reduction of work of breathing because it supports the inspiratory effort. So the first interface, which is the most commonly used interface for instituting NIV, is the full face mask. The main advantage of this interface is that it is, if properly fitting, it has very few air leaks. Very little cooperation is required from the patient and can be adjusted for comfort. The main disadvantage is that it can be sometimes be very claustrophobic, and it can, because of the pressure, can cause facial skin damage. And the other important disadvantage here is that the patient is not able to speak or cough or even eat and drink. And if one needs to eat and drink, one has to remove that mask. So that is a disadvantage. So for that, you also have the possibility of a nasal mask where the patient can easily eat, drink, cough effectively. There is no danger of vomiting and the patient aspirating. But the main disadvantage here of a nasal mask is that as soon as the patient opens the mouth, there is a leak of the air, there is air leak, and the advantage of the positive pressure is lost. So that is why it is not really used in these settings. It's just one of the options, but not really useful in COVID-19 situation. It can also cause possible nasal skin damage. Excuse me. So next we come to the interface, which is again become very popular during this pandemic, primarily for the reason that it is associated with the most minimum aerosol dispersion. It doesn't have air leaks, and therefore there is no aerosol dispersion, and the risk of transmission of infection to healthcare workers is the least. So this is the picture here shows the device, the interface, and it is called a helmet because it looks like a helmet. And the tolerance is much better because the patient doesn't feel very claustrophobic in this because there's no pressure on the face per se, and therefore there is no nasal or facial skin damage. The main disadvantage here is that sometimes because of the airflow, increased airflow, it can be very noisy. The patient can find that a little disturbing. And if the patient is on pressure support ventilation on a ventilator, there might be asymptomy sometimes, but that is not a major problem. And the other thing is, like you see here, the helmet is supported by these straps in the axillae, which can cause some discomfort. So whenever you're trying to use NIV, if you have the option of using any interface, then helmet mask is the interface of choice for the reason that I mentioned before, least aerosol dispersion. But whatever interface is available, easily available, should be used. If available, ICU ventilator should be used for these, for instituting NIV, primarily for the reason because you can put a viral filter and the chances of environmental contamination is very less. And as far as possible, always use a viral filter on the expiratory limb. One should initiate with a higher CPAP of about 10 centimeters of water and a PSV of 15 centimeters of water and titrate it to a respiratory rate of less than 20 per minute. Similarly, you start with an FiO2 of 1, but quickly down titrate it to target a saturation of 92 to 94%. The monitoring remains the same as in HFNC, and one should try and do EBG if it is available. So what are the contraindications? Any agitated or uncooperative patient, it will not be possible to apply NIV because these patients will not tolerate it, they'll pull it out. So that is not possible. If the patient has altered sensorium and is unable to protect airway, then again it is contraindicated. Any patient who has excessive vomiting or hemodynamic instability, or patients who have copious respiratory secretions are unable to clear it, then NIV is not the therapy of choice in these patients. The most common adverse effect of NIV is non-acceptance or the feeling of claustrophobia, especially a patient who is otherwise dyspneic and you clamp a mask over the face, obviously the claustrophobia is intense. But after it is initial, after the patients, the oxygen levels start improving, they become more tolerant. So initially, this is a major problem, but once the patient starts improving, the tolerance becomes better. Then if in the course of disease, if the sensorium is altered, there might be a certain risk of aspiration. So that should always be kept in the mind. Then one of the common side effects which is seen in patients, especially patients with COVID-19, is generation of excessive tidal volumes. Like I said, in the early part of the disease, the compliance is very good, the elastance is low. So they are capable of generating excessive tidal volumes. So this can lead to overdistension of alveoli and lung injury per se. So this is termed as self-induced lung injury. So this one should be very careful on when you're setting the IPAP, not to set at excessive values, because already these patients are generating excessive tidal volumes, and most often they will just require CPAP to correct their hypoxemia. Also, patients who have a low PF ratio, less than 150, an NIV is not really advisable. And studies have shown that in ARDS patients, that if NIV is instituted in patients with PF ratios less than 150, there is increased mortality. So then the main concern of oxygen therapy devices, like we all know, is the risk of aerosol generation. So all the oxygen therapy devices have some amount of aerosol generation, ranging from the maximum exhaled air dispersion distance being from 25 centimeters to 290 centimeters, depending on the type of device and also whether the patient is coughing and the total airflow that is being delivered. So it is very variable. But the point that I want to make here is that despite this, one should remember that all these figures that you are seeing here have been generated in a lab, in an artificial model, which have not been actually kind of confirmed in a real world scenario. So it may or may not be true. Even if it is true, studies now over the past 1.5 years, various studies have shown that if the healthcare workers are properly attired in full PPE, the chances of infection of the healthcare workers, despite any form of oxygen therapy device, is extremely low. So one should not be very, anxious about the infection, although there is always a risk, but the chances are extremely low if you are properly attired. So to sum up the oxygen therapy in these patients, a short algorithm. So when a patient comes to you with a saturation of less than 92 to 94% on room air and does not have respiratory distress, then one should start with delivery of oxygen via nasal cannula at 4 to 6 liters per minute and titrate it according to the saturation level. If the patient continues to be hypoxemic or a low saturation despite this oxygen, then one can go on to a non-rebreathing mask at 10 liters per minute or 15 liters per minute, depending on the oxygen saturation. If the patient has mild to moderate respiratory distress or has a saturation less than 90% on NRBM or a PF ratio of less than 300 but more than 150, then one should think in terms of instituting non-invasive strategies. Excuse me. So HFNC is the preferred modality, especially if the patient does not have associated hypercapnia. If the patient has associated hypercapnia or has underlying diseases like COPD, then NIV becomes the treatment of choice. If the patient presents to you with severe respiratory distress with a PF ratio less than 150 or a SF ratio of less than 196, and despite the initial management, and even if you try giving them oxygen through NRBM and the patient continues to have severe respiratory distress, that means increased work of breathing, eventually they are going to get tired out and the oxygen saturation is going to fall. So one does not want to wait in this group of patients and one should institute invasive mechanical ventilation. So a little about the high oxygen demand, especially pertaining to the situation in our country presently. So whenever you have a large load of patients who are requiring high oxygen requirement, there can be pressure drops in the oxygen supply system. One should also remember that if there is a sudden increase in the oxygen requirement, there can be icing of the vacuum insulated evaporators or the liquid oxygen tanks, and the oxygen supply can drop because of that as well. So one should ensure from the engineering teams that that is not the reason, but excessive obviously use will lead to pressure drops. So in these situations, one should remember not to initiate HFNO as the first treatment of choice, and it should be limited and should be actually prescribed by a consultant or a faculty where in patients where intubation can be harmful. So a limited use, because it takes up a lot of oxygen. So if you're giving an FiO2 say 80% through HFNC, it can take up flows as high as 40 to 50 liters per minute. So that is huge. So that can be used to treat a lot of other patients as well. So one should not initiate HFNO without actual indication. Then I would advise everybody to use the oxygen analyzer if it's available with CPAP and NIV machines, because it helps you to actually titrate the FiO2. Then another important thing which we often skip, which often skips our mind, is staggering of interventions that can lead to sudden surges in oxygen demand. For example, use of nebulizers. So whenever you use a nebulizer, you use a high flow of oxygen. Or the patient is on CPAP or NIV and wants to eat, and you shift because the patient is not able to maintain saturation, you shift him or her to HFNO. So when you're shifting to an HFNO, there is sudden surge in increase in oxygen requirement. So these should be staggered, and not all patients should be given these interventions at the same time. So if really required, these should be done so that there are no sudden pressure drops in the oxygen supply system. So besides this, how can one help in oxygen conservation? First and foremost, like Professor Guleria already emphasized, that one should avoid hyperoxemia. That means one should not target more than 94%. If you're giving oxygen flow at 6 liters per minute and to target saturation of 96%, then it is wasted. You reduce the flow via nasal cannula to 4 liters per minute so that the saturation stays around 92 to 94%. Because increasing the saturation, like Dr. Guleria already mentioned, above 94% actually provides no advantage. In fact, various studies in ARDS have shown that hyperoxemia actually is more detrimental to organ function, because it helps in releasing these free radicals, which can be injurious to the cells, and also because of the absorption atelectasis in the lung, which can lead to problems in itself. So one should avoid hyperoxemia. One should always down titrate the oxygen flow to the minimum. One should ensure that all oxygen flow has been turned off. Say the patient wants to eat or drink and has removed the mask for some time, quickly turn off the oxygen, because you're wasting the oxygen during that time. So one should turn off oxygen flow, even remove oxygen flow meters from the wall outlets, because sometimes when you keep the oxygen flow meters in the wall outlet, there might be some leak around the flow meters as well. But there should be some person who should be assessing and managing leaks from oxygen therapy devices at all times. Then another thing that often goes unnoticed is that when you are turning the oxygen flow meters up to the maximum, so the flow meter shows 15 liters per minute maximum. But if we keep turning it, although the indicator cannot go more than 15 liters per minute, the actual flow is actually increasing. So if you keep on turning the knob, the flow is increasing, but you think that it's just 15 liters per minute. It is actually increasing, and a lot of flow is wasted like that. So one should ensure that you do not turn it to the maximum. So like I said before, another adjunct to improving oxygenation is prone positioning, and it can lead to a reduction in your oxygen requirement. So prone positioning, like we all know, has been known, is an accepted modality for treating hypoxemia in patients with severe ARDS. It is also known to decrease mortality in these patients, in intubated patients. And the physiology behind this is that it homogenizes lung aeration, especially the posterior part, increases the pulmonary compliance and improves gas exchange, and thereby improves oxygenation. A wake prone positioning is a low risk procedure. It is very easily implemented. It can improve oxygenation early in the disease. However, one must know that there is actually no prospective data which shows that clear benefits of awake proning. I mean, we don't have randomized control trials. We have seen that patients improve their oxygen saturation level once they're turned prone, but we do not have randomized control trial to actually say that yes, they are useful in terms of morbidity or mortality. So the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has come out with the guidelines for proning for self-care, and the patient is asked to sleep on the tummy or belly. And ideally, what if one can do is to keep pillows under the chest and pillows under the pelvis, so that your abdomen is free without any compression. The main reason behind that is that there is unrestricted movement of the diaphragm, so that the ventilation is adequate. And this is a kind of a routine which one can follow, so that, because it's very difficult for patient to lie in a prone position for a very long time, especially when one is dyspneic. So one can try with start with 30 minutes to 2 hours of lying on your belly. Then you can turn to your right side. Then you can sit up for a while. Then go on to the left side. Then again go back to lying on your belly. So if the patient tolerates it well, it would be ideal to maintain the prone position to say about 16 hours in a day. But if not, how much ever is tolerated by the patient should be advised. So to conclude, oxygen therapy is the mainstay of treatment in patients with COVID-19 because it helps in reducing work of breathing. And like Professor Guleria said in the beginning, the most important thing here is that alleviates the need for ventilators. So oxygen therapy is more important than ventilators. Then the oxygen delivery methods can be decided depending on the availability and the need of the patient. HFNC is a very well tolerated ventilatory assist device with multiple advantages, especially in patients with COVID-19. But like I said before, it should be instituted carefully, especially in low resource settings where oxygen availability is a problem. All oxygen therapy devices have underlying risk of aerosol generation, but one should remember that oxygen therapy is indispensable, especially for patients with hypoxia, and they lead to a reduction of mortality. Thank you so much for your attention.
Sharing stop. Thank you very much, Dr. Vimi, for a very excellent talk, I would say, which highlights the most important parts as far as oxygen therapy is concerned. And I would just like to sort of emphasize a few points before we take the questions, I hand this over to Dr. Rajiv to get all the panelists on board. The first issue is, I think, what Dr. Vimi very importantly said, it's important to understand what is high flow and what is low flow oxygen. It's not related to the flow rate. It's not that if you have a 10-liter oxygen, it's a high flow oxygen. The high flow oxygen system is one which meets the entire inspiratory demand of the patient. So even a Venturi mask is a high flow system, although you may be giving it at a lower flow rate as compared to what is a low flow system. Also, although we are looking at this, there's another thing that was done. We used to do this almost 20 years ago when we didn't have oxygen concentrators and we used only oxygen cylinders, was what we called oxygen conserving devices. Now remember, when you use oxygen through a cylinder, almost 50% of the oxygen is wasted because you need oxygen only during inspiration. You don't need oxygen during expiration. So while you're expiring and you're breathing out, the cylinder is still working. To some extent, the non-rebreathing mask works, that it doesn't allow oxygen to be wasted. But we had oxygen conserving devices which are known as Pendolufts or Mustache, which were basically devices which had the cannula coming, and then you had a reservoir bag and then a simple valve. So when you used to breathe in, the valve would open and oxygen would come in. When you were breathing out, the valve would close. And while you were expiring, oxygen would get collected in the bag for the next inspiration. So that way you could double the life of your oxygen cylinders. At that point in time, many of these devices were purchased by the Indian Army because they could use this in remote areas where oxygen cylinders were being used, and they could double the life of oxygen cylinders. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind. I know that there is a company in Gujarat which is now again looking at making oxygen conserving devices so as to be able to really increase the life of oxygen cylinders. But in those places where you're using oxygen cylinders, you could use oxygen conserving devices, and that could also be helpful. One thing that has already been mentioned is that if you have decrease in your oxygen supply, please use non-invasive ventilation rather than HFNO. HFNO uses a lot of oxygen, and therefore it's better to use NIV more and more rather than HFNO. That will really conserve and save your oxygen. You also have to look at innovative devices. Just today morning, one of the faculty from our emergency told me that he's trying to see whether he can give oxygen to the patient through the nasal cannula rather than through the ventilator. And the ventilator is just giving room air so that then you can give lesser amount of oxygen because the ventilator is sucking in a lot of oxygen. So you can actually try and look at various things. There's the issue of the Bain circuit also, which can be looked at. As has already been said, that I would also suggest that all institutions that are using oxygen do an oxygen audit see how your oxygen is being used, how is it being misused in various wards. It may be worthwhile to develop an oxygen audit team, which could be a nurse in charge or one of your residents or even one of the undergraduate students who can just go around to see that oxygen is not wasted, that the knobs are all closed, that in each ward, in each area, there is no misuse of oxygen, or it's not, because sometimes, patient goes for an investigation. The cannula is just kept on the bed and you don't close it. And the oxygen gets being used, wasted there for half an hour while the patient comes back from a chest X-ray or a CT scan. So it's important for people to be aware that whenever it's not being used, the knob needs to be closed. And of course, what Dr. Vimy has already said, that giving too much of oxygen, hyperoxemia, can also be harmful. The data from various studies in ARDS patients actually showed that in ARDS, if you maintained a saturation of around 90-94, patient's outcome was better than maintaining a saturation of 98-99. And I think that is something that we need to keep in mind. So don't really give a high saturation and feel happy. You may be causing more harm to your patients. So these are the initial points that I wanted to make. And now I'll hand it over to Rajiv to really go through the questions. In case anyone in the audience has a question that he wants to ask on his own, please raise your hand and we'll try and sort of find you and you can ask the question directly then. So over to Dr. Rajiv.
Thank you, sir. Since we are also live on Doordarshan at this moment, including DD News, we have been requested to address some of the queries which would be common to the general public as well, rather than only that which is important to the panelists. So let me just begin, sir. ये भी हमको कहा गया है कि कई देखने वाले केवल हिंदी में समझ पाएंगे, तो कुछ हम इम्पोर्टेंट चीजें 4 बजे से पहले हिंदी में भी कवर करना चाहेंगे। सबसे जरूरी एक कॉमन सवाल जो 2-3 लोगों ने चैट पे डाला है वो ये है रोल ऑफ ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर्स। ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर्स को लेकर के पिछले कुछ दिनों में बहुत मारामारी भी हुई है, कई चीजों की कॉस्ट 3 गुना या 2 गुना कर दी गई है। So sir, what is the recommendation on the use of oxygen concentrators at home? So maybe you या डॉक्टर अंजन त्रिखा आप में से कोई को एड्रेस करना चाहें।
जो है वो एक हम जो कहते हैं एक लो फ्लो ऑक्सीजन सिस्टम है। पहले चीज समझना है कि ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर काम कैसे करता है। ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर हवा से ऑक्सीजन बनाता है। इट बेसिकली सक्स एयर फ्रॉम सक्स एयर इनटू द मशीन। मशीन में एक यू कैन हैव अ मॉलिक्यूलर सीव या एक और डिवाइस होता है जो इट्स क्रिस्टल व्हिच इज यूज्ड। इससे नाइट्रोजन अब्सॉर्ब हो जाती है। अगर हम हवा में से नाइट्रोजन अब्सॉर्ब कर लें तो वी हैव ओनली ऑक्सीजन लेफ्ट एंड सम डिग्री ऑफ trace gases and some degree of carbon monoxide which is left. So the oxygen concentrator works by just absorbing nitrogen and what is left is oxygen. लेकिन जो ऑक्सीजन उससे निकलती है that is around 94 to 95% pure. It is not 100% oxygen. तो इसलिए ये समझना जरूरी है। दूसरा ये है कि ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर्स का फ्लो रेट जो ज्यादातर ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर्स हमको मिलते हैं वो 5 लीटर्स तक का है। कुछ ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर्स आते हैं जो 8 से 10 लीटर तक भी ऑक्सीजन दे सकते हैं। So you can get oxygen from that, but it is only in a mild situation or a moderate situation. मैं ये भी कहना चाहूंगा कि जो लोग घर पे ऑक्सीजन ले रहे हैं, अगर उनकी सैचुरेशन ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर के से बावजूद 90 से कम होने लगती है, 88-90 हो रही है, then it is very important for them कि वो डॉक्टर से संपर्क करके हॉस्पिटल आए। There are patients that will keep on waiting till the saturation reaches 80 or 81, 82. That is not a good situation. ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर के बाद अगर आप उसको 2-3 लीटर पे आपकी सैचुरेशन 96 हो गई है तो यू कैन स्टिल वेट ऑल्दो इट्स अ डेंजरस सिचुएशन। आइडियली इट इज ओनली फॉर अर्ली माइल्ड डिजीज जब सैचुरेशन 94 से कम हो रही है। डोंट रिलाई टू मच ऑन एन ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर।
Thank you, sir. The other very common question that I see a number of people have put up is about buying cylinders at home. So what is the recommendation of this panel? Should we as a group of 4 or 5 people or a bunch of a family, should we be looking to buy cylinders and keeping them at home? Is that recommended or is it not recommended?
है कि सिलेंडर पहले तो ये समझना चाहिए हमें कि 2 तरह की ऑक्सीजन बाजार में मिलती है।
एक इंडस्ट्रियल ऑक्सीजन होती है, एक मेडिकल ग्रेड ऑक्सीजन होती है। आज के दिन हम बिकॉज ऑफ पेंडेमिक हम इंडस्ट्रियल ऑक्सीजन भी बहुत जगह इस्तेमाल की जा रही है, उसमें ज़्यादा फर्क नहीं होता एक्सेप्ट ह्यूमिडिफिकेशन और बैक्टीरिया के होने का चांस हो सकता है। हम ये एडवाइस करते हैं कि घरों में ऑक्सीजन सिलेंडर नहीं रखना चाहिए ऐसे इंडिविजुअली, बिकॉज वो एक एक्सप्लोजिव डिवाइस है, उसको उसका देखभाल करना चाहिए। अनलेस कोई डॉक्टर या नर्स आपके पास हो, या ऐसे सोसाइटीज हाउसिंग सोसाइटीज ने कर रखा है कि एक नीचे का कमरा हाउसिंग सोसाइटीज ने बना रखा है जहाँ पे ऑक्सीजन का बड़ा सिलेंडर है, उसके ऊपर प्रेशर रिड्यूसिंग वाल्व है और उसके आगे एक फ्लो मीटर है। उसके बिना ये सिलेंडर रखना बिल्कुल बेकार है। और जैसे डॉक्टर गुलेरिया ने पहले बताया कि सिलेंडर तो ले आए बट उसको करना क्या है वह मालूम नहीं है। ये हमेशा ध्यान रखना चाहिए कि उसके आसपास अगर कोई सिगरेट या अगरबत्ती या धूप जलाई जाए तो उससे वो बिल्कुल एक्सप्लोजन हो सकता है। सो इन प्रिंसिपल 4 लोगों को मिलकर जिनको इसके बारे में ज्ञान नहीं है, हम नहीं प्रमोट करेंगे कि वो घर में ऑक्सीजन सिलेंडर रखें। ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर एक ऑल्टरनेटिव है जो इस्तेमाल किया जाता है। ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर के बारे में एक चीज मैं और बताना चाहूंगा कि अगर आप आज के दिन देखें पूरे व्हाट्सएप में ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर के जो लिटरेचर होता है या उसमें क्या चीज होती है वो घूम रही है, उसमें वो फ्लो रेट लिखा होता है और एक मैक्सिमम परसेंटेज लिखी होती है। ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर के द्वारा जो ऑक्सीजन मिलती है हमें वो 93 से 95% तक की मिलती है। बट उसमें आपको ये देखना है कि जो 10 लीटर वाला है ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर, उसकी मैक्सिमम 10 लीटर पे क्या कंसंट्रेशन हो रही है। कई बार वो जो इंडस्ट्री वाले लोग हैं वो लिख देते हैं कि 95% है, बट वो सिर्फ 1 या 2 लीटर पे है। जब उसको आप 10 लीटर पे कर देंगे तो ये 85% हो जाएगी और इसलिए वो उसकी कीमत बढ़ा देते हैं। तो थोड़ा सा किसी जानकार आदमी से बात कर लें और तब जाके ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर खरीदें। और सिलेंडर के लिए तो नहीं, ऐसा नहीं करना चाहिए अनलेस कोई जानकार आदमी आपके साथ हो, कोई डॉक्टर हो या कोई नर्स हो जो उसको मैनेज करना चाहे। अगर उसका वैल्व आप ऊपर से खोलेंगे और जैसे एक नॉर्मल घर के रन से अगर उसका सिलेंडर का वैल्व खोल देंगे तो उसमें से जेट ऑक्सीजन का जेट इतनी जोर से आता है कि ये एक डॉक्यूमेंटेड फैक्ट है कि अगर थोड़ा सा झुक के खोलते हैं तो उसकी जो ऑक्सीजन का जेट आता है वो आपकी आंख पे पड़ता है और आप अंधे हो जाते हैं। ऐसी इंजरीज ऑपरेशन थिएटर में अक्सर देखी गई हैं, तो इसको ध्यान से रखना चाहिए।
और दूसरा आई वुड जस्ट लाइक टू ऐड, एक चीज मैं यही कहना चाहूंगा कि वी आर एक्चुअली डूइंग मोर हार्म टू द पेशेंट्स हु नीड ऑक्सीजन बाय स्टोरिंग सिलेंडर्स एट होम। कई लोगों ने अब ये कर दिया कि हम अपने घर पे 4-5 सिलेंडर रख लेते हैं। दिस इज कॉजिंग एन अननेसेसरी शॉर्टेज ऑफ ऑक्सीजन फॉर दोज हु एक्चुअली नीड ऑक्सीजन। क्योंकि ऑक्सीजन अगर आप सिलेंडर्स में ऑक्सीजन भर के घर पे रख लोगे तो आप किसी व्यक्ति को हानि पहुंचा रहे हो जिसको ऑक्सीजन की जरूरत है। और ऑक्सीजन अगर आप घर पे ठीक से यूज नहीं करोगे तो जैसे हम इतनी देर से बता रहे हैं कि उससे ज्यादा नुकसान हो सकता है। इसलिए काइंडली जस्ट फॉलो प्रॉपर प्रोटोकॉल। आइडियल सिचुएशन में ऑक्सीजन हॉस्पिटल में ही लेनी चाहिए। अगर ऑक्सीजन हॉस्पिटल में मुश्किल हो रही है तो होम कॉन्सेंट्रेटर ऑक्सीजन कॉन्सेंट्रेटर यूज कर सकते हैं या फिर किसी डॉक्टर से या हेल्थ केयर पर्सनल से ही संपर्क करके ऑक्सीजन घर पे लें। नहीं तो इट कैन बी मोर डेंजरस एंड कैन कॉज मोर प्रॉब्लम, जैसे डॉक्टर अंजन ने बताया।
Right, sir. We take the next one now, which is more on medical issues. And this is somebody who says that the oxygen saturation fluctuates during the day. Maybe it's posture related or time related. So there are times it drops below 92 and there are times when it hovers between 92 to 95. What should be my trigger for starting oxygen therapy? Is it the occasional drop or should it be a sustained low saturation?
Maybe I'll ask Dr. Vimmi if she can answer this so that we can have other panelists also.
Yes, sir. Actually, a sustained drop in saturation less than 92% should kind of warrants oxygen therapy, because like he himself said that the oxygen saturation for any individual varies through the days depending on your posture and other things. So if it is sustained maybe for half an hour, the saturation remains below 92%, then one should be, or 94%, then one should think of kind of contacting a doctor or healthcare physician for the need of oxygen therapy. But if it is remaining most of the times more than 94%, 94, 95%, then one really doesn't need to kind of look for oxygen therapy.
So I'm going to stretch this question because
okay,
a couple of
I just like to add something, that ideal situation you should be resting, sitting for at least 15 minutes and then take your oxygen saturation, and that will give you what your baseline saturation is. कई दफा लोग ये कहते हैं कि मैं बाथरूम से आया और मैंने एकदम लगा दिया, और वो 88 हो गया, लेकिन फिर 2 मिनट बाद वो 95 हो गया. So there will be some fall in oxygen saturation on exertion, which you should not panic about. So oxygen saturation at resting while you're sitting quietly for at least 10-15 minutes, उसके बाद करके देखें, and then get an idea of how much it should be.
In continuation of this question is another caveat that the saturation is below 92 on general, but if I prone myself, it goes above 94. So would that fit into saying that this is somebody who needs to come to the hospital, or should he just prone and watch?
Neeraj, what is your comments?
Sir, again, this could be a subtle sign of patient may expected to deteriorate with time. But if his saturation is increasing with proning, a close observation, and if it is not able to increase beyond 92 on proning persistently, then one can think of running to hospital and getting admitted there. But again, how you are taking saturation, as sir mentioned it earlier, that use of oxygen probe is something which needs to be done properly. Sometimes you panic, you start taking shallow breath because you see the reading is coming below 90. 90 के नीचे reading आ रहा, आप घबराकर और shallow breathing करने लगते हैं, and things get precipitated. So always rest, saturation check कीजिए, proning, lateral जैसे भी comfortably आप लेट सकते हैं, and if it is persistently above 92, I don't think you should panic. जब लगातार 90 के नीचे है तो ही एक ऐसा पैनिक बटन दबाना चाहिए कि जिस पे एडमिशन के बाद हमें सोचने की जरूरत है.
And another question which then stems off, Neeraj, from this point is, how do you measure the saturation to make sure it's accurate? Because there are tons of devices out in the market. And is there a particular technique or a way in which saturation should be measured? A particular posture or a particular technique or a particular device?
So the सबसे important aspect जो इस पे है कि always use same oximeter. ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि हर बार एक अलग-अलग oximeter use कर रहे हैं. Second thing, always check the battery of the oximeter, क्योंकि आप multiple times use करते हैं, बैटरी की क्वालिटी अगर अच्छी नहीं है तो सेंसिटिविटी उसकी कम हो सकती है. एंड अगेन ये जो टेंडेंसी की वॉक करने के बाद सैचुरेशन चेक करना, आई थिंक वो फॉल्स अलार्म क्रिएट करता है और लोग परेशान हो जाते हैं. तो ऑलवेज रेस्ट फॉर एट लीस्ट 5 minutes, प्रेफरेबली अप टू 10 to 15 minutes, either in sitting position or lying position, and the hand should be at the heart level of the heart. Fingers should not be bent, wrist should not be bent. Basically जो भी रीजन से अगर आपका ऑक्सीजन ब्लड फ्लो ऑब्स्ट्रक्ट होगा तो सेंसिटिविटी ऑफ दिस ऑक्सीजन ऑक्सीमीटर में बी रिड्यूस्ड. सो इन सब चीज़ों का ध्यान रखते हैं, स्पेशली फीमेल्स वो इंश्योर करें कि उनके नेल्स पे कोई नेल पॉलिश ना हो, एंड ट्राई टू यूज द सेम फिंगर ऑल द टाइम. तो इन सब चीज़ों का ध्यान रखते हुए हम सही से सैचुरेशन चेक कर सकते हैं और जो फॉल्स रीडिंग आती है उसको अवॉइड कर सकते हैं.
Thank you, Neeraj. And since this is a panel,
Rajiv, can I add?
please, yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is that one should ensure that the probe is applied correctly. So if it is done upside down, it will not give a correct reading. So people can look at the red light that is emitting from inside the probe, and that red light should be on the base of the nail, on the nail bed. And it should not be like, you don't keep pushing the finger inside so that the nail bed is way ahead of the light. So it will not give you a correct reading. Also, sometimes when your hands are very cold, there is vasoconstriction, the blood flow is not adequate, it might give you a false reading. So what you can do, what the patient can do is rub the hands nicely, the fingertips. So that will increase the blood flow on the nail tips and give you the accurate reading. And also ensure that the waveform that you're getting on the pulse oximeter is regular. So that will tell you that the reading is correct.
Since we do have a large number of regional and state centers of excellence on this panel, maybe invite them if they would like to add comments on the use of the pulse oximeter. Yes, sir, from Jodhpur.
Not on the pulse oximeter, but actually on oxygen concentrator. Just one thing I wanted to add, that most of the oxygen concentrators, they don't have a battery backup because it's a motor which is involved and it sucks lots of power. So in case there is power cut at home and a person is using oxygen concentrator at home and there is power cut, it will shut down and it won't provide any oxygen flow. So one has to be very cautious about it. Just a note of caution.
Right. Thank you, sir. Anybody else on the panel?
Rajiv, can I add something to this?
Of course, sir.
Okay. एक और चीज जो है ये ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर की, एक जब ये कमरे में चलता है तो रात को थोड़ी सी आवाज होती है, एंड वो आवाज से वो आपको एक्सेप्ट करना पड़ेगा. और ये भी देखा गया कि अगर एक बड़े कमरे में आपने 2 लगा रखे हैं तो वहाँ पे थोड़ा सा टेम्परेचर बढ़ जाता है क्योंकि उसकी मोटर चलती रहती है। तो ये आपको देखना पड़ेगा कि हर एक ऑक्सीजन कंसंट्रेटर के जो उसके साथ लिटरेचर मिलता है उस पर क्या लिखा हुआ है कि वो कांस्टेंट कितने घंटे इस्तेमाल किया जा सकता है। ये दो चीजों का देखना बड़ा जरूरी है। और उसके पीछे दीवार नहीं होनी चाहिए और पीछे वेंटिलेशन, जैसे आप अपने फ्रिज या रेफ्रिजरेटर के पीछे एक सामान वो रखते हैं, वो होना चाहिए, नहीं तो वो जो उसकी मोटर है गर्म होके खराब हो जाएगी।
Right. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. From
One can look
AFMC.
at other than just the oxygen saturation, look at the tachypnea as well, in the sense that the patient is getting a little bit distressed. So that will be one sign which can correlate along with that is the oxygen saturation which is falling. So both the things can be correlated together. Patient would find it more easier to measure his own respiratory rate, or somebody can measure it for him. So you can add the two together. And regarding pulse oximeter, maybe ambient light also, some tube lights can hamper the reading on the pulse oximeter. So that's something that they need to keep in mind. And there are things that they can look into.
Right. So I think the point you make about the use of other markers other than just a pulse ox was something that has come up in the previous 2 or 3 panel discussions also, that the pulse ox may not be as widely available as we would want it to be. And therefore, local doctors, local clinicians will have to develop their own surrogate markers to suggest, look for danger signs, which may not only be pulse oximeter based.
I just want to add on to that. Two things. One was that pulse oximeter may not be available everywhere, especially when we start talking of small towns, small cities, and therefore one will have to develop a strategy of seeing the degree of respiratory rate, teaching people how to look at that, and looking at other clinical signs, as was mentioned by Dr. Vimi also, of using accessory muscles of respiration or other features which may suggest that the person is tachypneic. There's also another test which I think I can open it for the group also to discuss, which some of us have used in the past, is what we call a 6-minute walk test. We usually would make a person walk for 6 minutes and then see what happens to the saturation and the heart rate. And that may give you an indication of whether there is a fall in saturation or a rise in heart rate after 6 minutes, which is also telling you that what is the cardiopulmonary reserve of the patient in terms of going into more severe disease and needing more close monitoring. One can even ask the patient to walk for 6 minutes and see whether he gets more dyspneic or he feels out of breath. So these are other signs that one can use of trying to see how the patient feels, or asking him to maintain a chart of how he was yesterday, how he is today, and on every day does he feel more breathless and when he goes to the toilet, or when he exerts himself. And therefore using some subjective, say like a visual analog scale, to try and pick up the degree of dyspnea that the patient may have, and be able to use that rather than oxygen saturation if it is not available.
Right, thank you, sir. So we'll just move on to the more oxygen therapy in hospital part of the webinar, since we don't want to be talking more about home isolation today. So this question is again from a physician. What are the advantages and disadvantages using Bain circuit for spontaneous respiration through a BiPAP mask? And what are the flows required? If you're using a Bain circuit, what would be the flows required for a BiPAP mask?
Vimi, you would like to
take that?
Sir, yes. So actually use of a Bain circuit with the BiPAP mask is really not advocated. So a CPAP or a BiPAP masks are of various types. One is a standalone unit which is capable of delivering, it runs on electricity and is capable of delivering BiPAP or a CPAP using a mask and a ventilated tubing. Then you have devices where you don't need a standalone unit, you don't need electricity to run it. So you need an oxygen source which is connected to a mask which has a Buzanach valve, or it has a venturi valve along with it, with the Buzanach valve, which means that the amount of flow that is generated by the oxygen and the air entrained to the venturi actually kind of manages to generate a CPAP. So in this system, you don't need any electricity, you just need an oxygen wall outlet for using that device. So these two kind of devices do not need a Bain circuit, and really a Bain circuit for delivering a BiPAP is really not indicated, because Bain circuit is basically meant for giving anesthesia using a low flow, so a relatively low flow than the other open circuits. So I would not recommend using a Bain circuit for giving oxygen therapy through a CPAP or a BiPAP.
Rajiv, can I add something?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Bain circuit is a Mapleson D kind of a circuit where you have a reservoir bag at the end of it, and it's a coaxial circuit where there are two tubing which you go into each other, and then there's an outlet which is the patient end. So if you put a mask on the patient end, and that's why it has been used in this pandemic, because it is very cheap. A normal Bain circuit can come to a hospital would cost only about 300 to 400 rupees, and it's a disposable thing. But what has to be realized is that you would need a flow of about 5 to 7 liters, and there is an expiratory wall at the distal end, which will be away from the patient. So if you close that distal end, there will be a lot of pressure generated, and the expired air can't really go out. So for spontaneously breathing patient, you can it's a spring-loaded valve. You can tighten it a bit, and you presume that you are giving some amount of positive pressure, and let the refilling bag, which is at the distal end, inflate and deflate, and you get an idea of what is happening. So this is being used as a surrogate for a better device, which is slightly costlier. And it's been rightly said, it is not very ideal, but in these pandemic situations, everything is being used. But equally important is using a lot of oxygen from the wall outlet. That becomes a waste of oxygen, which is being open to the atmosphere of an ICU or whatever setting we have. There are a lot of videos doing in the WhatsApp where they are shown using Bain circuits, Mapleson D, even Mapleson E has been used for that purpose. But these are all stopgap devices, and ideally we should try to go on a CPAP kind of a device, which has been talked about earlier.
So Dr. Bhatia at Jodhpur wanted to add something.
Yeah, just I would like to add on what Dr. Anjan has said, that if the flows comes down in Bain circuit by mistake or accidentally, there will be a lot of rebreathing and CO2 retention in the patient. So that way it is not good. And secondly, when the patient is in respiratory distress, the peak inspiratory flow rate also rises, which the Bain circuit won't be possible to provide the Bain circuit. Because in a healthy patient, yes, with a flow rate of 6-7 liters, the rebreathing may be avoided and CO2 retention may be avoided. But when the patient is in respiratory distress, spontaneously breathing, the peak inspiratory flow rate rises to 20-30 liters per minute. So in that case, the Bain circuit won't be providing that much of flows. So either there will be distress or CO2 rebreathing. That's my take.
Right.
The last thing is, Rajiv, that
Can I add, Rajiv? Rajiv, can I?
Yes, ma'am. But we'll need to keep all answers relatively short, because we have a huge list if you want to go on to finish them. But please carry on. Please complete it. Please carry on, Dr. Milme.
So the other disadvantage of using Bains is that you cannot estimate the amount of PEEP you're getting. So you're basically fiddling with the valve to generate some amount of PEEP, but you don't know how much PEEP you are administering. So it can be too low or too high, which can be detrimental. And like Dr. Anjan said, that you are delivering 100% oxygen, which itself can be detrimental to the patient and lead to a lot of wastage of oxygen, which is not really recommended in the present situation.
Thank you. So the next question that we have is that if you're using a helmet interface, should the circuit have two limbs? That means inspiratory and expiratory compulsorily.
So Dr. Rimi can answer that.
So the helmet interface comes like I showed in the picture. It usually is attached to a ventilator. It has two limbs. The initial thing, which is divided into expiratory and inspiratory, and the expiratory limb is where you kind of attach the viral filter. So it does have an expiratory limb as well.
It already has two limbs.
Okay. So the next thing is there any adverse effect of proning?
Proning.
If the proning is not done properly,
Yes.
and this must be a conscious patient, because we're not talking about invasive ventilation here. So in a conscious patient, is there any adverse effect of proning?
See, the issue is when you are asking a
So
patient.
there is.
Okay,
Yeah, Rimi, go ahead.
Dr. Anjan first. Let Dr. Anjan finish first.
No, Rajiv, let the lady talk, please.
Okay, sorry. Let the lady finish first.
So there are a few contraindications to avoid proning. First is patients who are pregnant. So one would not advise proning in patients who are pregnant, because that would cause compression. And excessively obese patient would also find it difficult because of the mass of the central obesity. It is sometimes difficult. The other thing is that if you lie in a particular position for a very long time, there can be some sores. But otherwise, other than that, in awake self-proning, there is actually really no problem or any complication that can occur because of proning itself.
So Dr. Anjan.
Okay, right.
Right.
What we have realized, Vimi, can I take it up?
Go
Okay.
ahead.
What I have realized over the past 14 months is that there would be some group of patients who will be very comfortable to sleep, to lie prone, and you can ask them that, do you sleep prone? There are quite a lot number of us who sleep prone and they are comfortable doing that. The problem comes when you have a patient who's a borderline patient saturating at about 90, but when he prones, he's 92, then somebody needs to keep a track of it. Third thing is a lot of Indians would have truncal obesity, men and even women for that matter, they are unable to lie prone. They are now advised, what we have been doing is that please lie on a right side up and a left side up and intermittently do it. And lastly, please don't do it after meals. Whatever meal they have taken, they should wait for a couple of hours and then try to lie prone. People have started realizing that if they lie prone, they can avoid going to a hospital, they can increase their saturation, which is very good. But now they are overdoing it. They are eating and drinking lying prone. You can see a lot of straws, cokes, and everything, which is all happening in prone. खाना भी क्या prone तरीके से खाया जा रहा है. That is not really on. If you are able to do it for about 8, 10, 12 hours and doing everything else, it's okay.
I'd just like to add that again, if you are not, especially in obese people, if you are not able to lie prone, even if you lie in your left lateral and right lateral position, it will also help in terms of the gas exchange and improving your saturation. So in obese people, sometimes it's just good enough to make them lie as much as they can on the left and right lateral rather than insisting they lie prone, because it causes a lot of discomfort. And obviously, you should not eat while you're in the prone position. It can lead to a lot of reflux, and chance of aspiration are also there.
Right, sir. We'll take the next one now. So what are the criteria for switching from non-invasive to invasive ventilation? When do you give up the non-invasive and move to invasive? So we do have a present webinar tomorrow on invasive ventilation, but maybe we could just briefly give the endpoints for non-invasive ventilation here.
So Anjan, you can start.
Okay, fine. See,
Yeah.
it's very much on that anybody who's dealing with patients who would be prone or who would be kept on a high flow nasal oxygenation device or a cannula or a NIV or a BiPAP is aware of the fact that when you have to change or switch over to an invasive ventilation, it's slightly better to do it earlier than later. That is the first thing. The other thing is, if you think that a patient is difficult to intubate, slightly do it when expert help is available than when expert help is not available at that level. You can err on the side of doing it slightly earlier. Third thing is that what has happened in the diseases, and I'll tell you what has happened to us. We were delaying a lot of intubations in the first phase. We were trying to have, we coined the term as permissive hypoxia, permissive hypercapnia was always there. But now we try to intubate them earlier because I think we can get the patients out better if we intubate earlier. If you think a patient is tiring, and normally what you see is they normally graduate from a simple mask to a high flow nasal cannula or a NIV, and then they tire out. You see they are totally, they are sweating, they're tiring it out. And high flow nasal cannulas and NIVs can only work for some time. The patients will surely tire out, and then they will surely try to retain carbon dioxide and have all the features of hypercarbia. So these are the clinical symptoms when you can decide that now, right, this patient is not going to make it, and we'll have to take away the work of breathing and intubate these patients. At the same time, if you have good enough features, or if you have an ABG which is regularly, you can do it in your ICU, or you have an RTL9 in place, or even if you have an EtCO2 device where you can approximately come to know what is happening to the EtCO2 values, you can decide to intubate. But clinical parameters, what I've told, are very important when you're talking about deciding from non-invasive to invasive, and it should be done slightly earlier than in an ICU setting later, when everybody is donned with a PPE, and your expertise to intubate a slightly obese person or a difficult area becomes all the more difficult. See, we must realize that we are working with PPEs and our efficiency is decreasing. And whoever was able to do something within 5 minutes is taking about 10 minutes. So it's slightly earlier to go into a non-invasive once we've realized that this patient is not going to tolerate non-invasive for a longer time. So we must intubate him.
Right, sir. So before I take the next question, if there's anybody on the panel who'd like to come in at any point of time, please just raise your hand and we'd be happy to bring you in, either to add a comment or ask a question. So anybody on the panel, please just raise your hand and we'd be happy to bring you in at any point of time. So the next question is, which chest physiotherapy would you generally recommend to people, again, who are not, while they're in the hospital on oxygen therapy? So what chest physiotherapy is recommended? Are there any exercises that they should be specifically doing?
Dr. Neeraj, you want to answer that?
Neeraj, you want to add that? Yeah, thanks.
So normally we ask them to at least do deep breathing exercises intermittently. That is taking deep breaths through nose and exhaling through mouth. And they should be doing it for at least 30 seconds to 1 minute intermittently. That definitely helps. Apart from that, wherever feasible, if patient is stable enough to do incentive spirometry, we encourage that also. Apart from that, we have physiotherapists who come and do some chest exercise, including what we call thapki dena on the back, as well as we have this ultrasound machines also, which helps in physiotherapy. So depending on what is the oxygen requirement of the patient, whether it's low requirement or high requirement, we have to tailor the necessary physiotherapy. But yes, early initiation of physiotherapy in such patients definitely help.
So I would just like to add, early initiation of physiotherapy would be useful. And as Neeraj said, breathing exercises, especially which are focused on the diaphragm, would be useful. Sometimes you would also ask the person to do exercises around the shoulder girdle. That is the upper limb exercises, because you also want to improve the rib cage movement. So shoulder girdle exercises in terms of upper limb exercises may also help. And along with that, incentive spirometer. But it's also good to encourage the patient to really breathe deeply and try and cough and clear his chest, so that many patients would say that if they do that, after some time the saturation actually tends to improve, because sometimes that helps in terms of opening up the airways.
Right, sir. The next question
Rajiv, can
is.
I add something? Rajiv, just one more thing. Another thing that I would advocate is active exhalation through pursed lips. So when you exhale through pursed lips, it's like kind of adding an expiratory resistance. So it gives a PEEP-like effect. So that I've seen helps a lot of patients, because it opens up the atelected portions of the lung.
I would agree with that, especially in COPD patients. Pursed lip breathing would also help, because it creates a little bit of PEEP and therefore gas exchange improves. So that's something that you can teach patients to do.
Right, sir. Now, the next thing we have is, what should be the flow rates if you're using an NRBM? What is the minimum flow rate at which you should be using an NRBM? What is the maximum you should give before you switch on to HFNC or something else?
So Dr. Vimy, you had already touched upon this.
Yes, sir. So like I said previously, the minimum flow which is required to keep the reservoir bag inflated is 10 liters per minute. So you need to give a minimum flow of 10 liters per minute. And with that, if the mask fit is tight, you are delivering an FiO2 0.8 liters. So basically NRBM you're going to use when the oxygen by nasal cannula or face mask has failed to treat the hypoxemia. So you're delivering a higher oxygen, higher FiO2 through an NRBM. So 10 liters, if you want to increase the FiO2 even more, then you increase to 15 liters. Increasing the oxygen flow more than this is not really required, and it's not going to be beneficial. What was the second part of the question, Rajiv?
So that was about basically what should be the minimum flow rate and what should be the highest that you should go on an NRBM before you switch to an alternative mode of therapy.
Yeah, so 10 and 15 liters. So you can't go more than 15 liters. It's not going to give you any additional advantage.
Right. Now, the next question is the role of that 6-minute test in a patient who is maintaining a saturation above 92. Do they still need to do a 6-minute test if at rest they're at greater than a 92?
Neeraj can answer that question.
So again, I personally feel that this creates more confusion than actually helping the patient. So as long as your saturation is holding fine in your sedentary part, and you don't, anyway, we ask all these patients to rest for most of the time. We don't ask them to exert, because exertion in such situation may be dangerous for the patient. So if you are able to maintain your saturation in sitting position without exerting, then it's okay. And we don't advocate that you should go for 6-minute walk test every time and see whether you are desaturating or not, because most of the patient will desaturate on 6-minute walk test. And this is not going to give any extra information about his or her reserve or what will be the outcome. So if you're desaturating while sitting or with minimal effort, then that is something we have to be careful of.
Okay. Now the next question, I think Dr. Vimy will need to take this. How do you identify the remaining amount of oxygen in a cylinder? What are the parameters which would tell you that your oxygen is about to run out?
So a E-type cylinder, when it is full, will generate about 2000 psi of pressure, which is pounds per square inch. Okay. So when it is full, it will be 2000, and you can see that on the pressure gauge. So as the oxygen goes on depleting, the pressure will fall. So when it comes to near zero, say about a little more than zero, then it is only about 5 to 10 liters of oxygen that is left. So you look at the pressure gauge and decide how much. So if it come down to half, then the total, say the capacity of E-type cylinder is 600 liters, 660 liters. So when it comes down to half of the pressure, say from 2000 comes to 1000, then about 300 liters of oxygen is left. So you know the total capacity of the oxygen in liters and the total pressure. So E-type cylinders, which we use in an anesthesia machine, has 660 liters, and a jumbo cylinder, which is H-type, has around 7000 liters. So, and a pressure of 2200 psi. So accordingly, it translates. It's unlike those liquid gases where it is difficult to tell the pressure, because unless, and you look at the weight, like in nitrogen, you look at the weight, not at the total pressure, because it keeps on getting converted to oxygen, and then the pressure remains constant. But here, the total pressure is actually reflective of the total amount of gas that is in the cylinder. So if it is 2000 psi, the total volume is 660 liters, and once it is half of the total volume.
Okay, so the next question is, patients are on NIV are often irritable and find it difficult to tolerate the mask. So can we sedate them?
No, I think, can I take it? Yeah, I think it is not a very right approach to sedate patients who are on NIV if they get irritated, because a lot of harm can be done than benefit if you try to sedate these patients. Sedation of patients on NIV in ICUs has been there in the literature for a long time, but all those things come from a place where you have 1:1 nurse-patient ratio, and they just stand with the patient's hand in the nurse's hand. So as a principle, sedating patients who are on NIV, getting irritated, giving them small dose of midazolam or fentanyl is not really advocated. It could be a simple clinical feature of getting hypoxic. A patient gets hypoxic, he becomes irritable, tries to throw away the mask. So you will cause more harm than you will cause benefit. So it's a big no as far as the general practice is concerned.
In general practice, you should not give sedation. You see, the non-invasive ventilation is triggered by the patient. The patient is the one who starts the inspiration, and the expiration is also done by that if you're giving a BiPAP. And therefore, if the patient is sedated or drowsy, or there's the suppression of the respiratory center, most NIVs don't have a backup. That if you don't have good nursing care, you may be causing more problem, because the patient may not trigger the non-invasive ventilation, and you may not actually be able to have an efficient oxygen delivery. So sedation should be avoided as far as NIV is concerned.
Right, sir. I would like to clarify to the attendees and participants on the webinar that we are only taking questions which relate to today's topic. There are dozens of questions on managing COVID, dozens of personal histories which have been put up with advice. This webinar is not to address individual personal management issues, and we are focusing only on queries related to today's topic. So the next question is again something very common in most hospitals: splitting the channel from 1 into 2 patients or 3 patients. Can it be done? What are the potential harms, and what should you be careful about? One oxygen point, multiple patients.
Why connection?
Why connection?
If you remember, when the last surge came, and I still distinctly remember the day when Dr. Guleja gave me a couple of literatures which had come from Italy and France, where they were willing to ship to us some devices where you could use 5 ventilators through a single pipeline, and the Y connections. So on our own, we took these devices to a simulated lab, and we realized that they couldn't really deliver the right kind of tidal volumes in varying level of compliances, different compliant lungs. Okay. And the other issue is that if you are using ventilators, the other issue is if you have a Y connection with the patient giving oxygen, obviously the flow is going to get down. And what are you going to do something about the infection rates? Infection rates are going to be, increased. And that's why we in principle don't really advise using Y connections or splitters for ventilators for per se. And yes, in a pandemic situation, if you have one outlet and you have 3 patients, well, fine, you can use a Y connection and U8 if somebody is really getting hypoxic or desaturating at 80 or 78. A lot of people are doing that at homes with concentrators of 10 liters per minute flow rates. They are having both 2 patients at the same time. But in principle, it is a big no, because you are going to cause a lot of cross infection. As a rescue measure, you can do anything for that.
Yeah, so basically, I think Anjan is talking of two things. One is using connections to really share ventilators. What was done in Italy was that they were using one ventilator for 2 patients, where they're using different connections. But you will have to look at air resistance, compliance, and the body surface area of the 2 patients. But because of that, they had come up with a policy and various. And I remember that time we tried this out using your simulator that you have 2 people who can share a ventilator with a separate connection. The second is a Y connection given for patients who need just low flow oxygen, which is something that is done in many emergencies. And I mean, as residents, we've done it when you had many patients coming to your casualty and you had your Y connection and the tubings going all over the place from one patient to the other while patients were crowded in the emergency. So, Anjan said, desperate times calls for desperate measures, but there are risks involved in that. And as much as it can be avoided, we should try and do that. But if you have a surge of cases and you have just 1 or 2 oxygen points, and you can then give a higher flow rate but divide it into 2 and have the tubing going to 2 patients, is something that can be done. But as we've said, that best to avoid. But I do accept the fact that there are times when you will have to do that.
Somebody wants to talk.
I think AFMC Pune wants to.
When we do this, we put a Y connection on low oxygen flow also. The connection generally doesn't split the oxygen equally, the flow equally. So one patient might end up getting no flow, the other patient might end up getting more flow. So that's what we realized. And then we stopped our splitting of this Y connectors.
Correct. That's also a point.
Right, sir. So the next question probably originates on the Twitter University. How many oxygen concentrators in a room will lead to depletion of oxygen for everybody else in that room?
Okay, I mentioned this in that today morning meeting also, because one journalist sent it to me that if you use oxygen concentrator in a room, the oxygen in the room will become less, and those who are not using oxygen will have hypoxemia. So maybe Vimi can address that question, because that was sent to me.
Sir, actually, that this actually is unfounded. The concern is unfounded, actually, because what the concentrated, like you mentioned earlier, is just taking the room air and removing the nitrogen and giving oxygen, purified oxygen to the patient. But it's not as if it's an airtight room. See, the air is being entrained continuously into the room. So there is actually no lack of air in the room. So it's not going to cause hypoxia to the other patient who has normal lungs, who's breathing 21% of oxygen, which is available in the air. So I don't think this concern is really valid.
The other thing which has to be realized is that there is, had been taught expired air resuscitation. Mouth-to-mouth breathing was a term when I was an intern or house surgeon. So when we breathe in 21% of oxygen, we are delivering out, or we are exhaling 16% of that oxygen. So that room, unless I put you into a cage which is airtight and put an oxygen concentrator and I'm seeing you slowly dying, one of those things, it can never happen. And this has to be put across, not in this panel. I'm sure everybody here is aware of it. This has to be put across on a citizen forum where these kind of things are going on.
Right, sir. So, I mean, it's obviously something which has caught the fancy of the social media. So it's good to clarify those issues here. The other question here is concomitant use of antitussive with chest physiotherapy. So are they counterproductive? On the one hand, you're using cough suppressants, and on the other hand, you want to use chest physiotherapy. So is it okay to use cough suppressants while you use chest physiotherapy in a patient on oxygenation?
So I'll ask Neeraj to answer that question.
So sometimes too much cough causes basically respiratory fatigue in the patient. They are not comfortable. They start developing chest pain, and that causes discomfort. So in that situation, we do advise antitussive so that we can suppress cough, so that at least patient can sleep and the chest pain and other things which have started happening subsides. And of course, if we do active physiotherapy, chest physiotherapy, that's going to definitely help. So when we say we should allow patient to cough, that doesn't mean we should allow patient to continue coughing so that he's not feeling well. So it has to be a judgmental call. I mean, judiciously, you have to take a call how much cough you want to suppress, how much cough you want to allow. But yes, antitussives are not going to affect the physiotherapy aspect of the patient, and both can be used simultaneously.
Yeah, so physiotherapy can be continued. I just wanted to add one thing, which is maybe, I mean, I'm not saying that this is something which has a lot of scientific basis, but what I've noticed in some of our patients, they have a little bit of bronchial hyperreactivity, which causes the cough. And if you ask them to take inhaled steroids, budesonide, which we otherwise give based on the trial which came out, which showed it was useful, their cough also tends to improve. So sometimes it's worthwhile rather than giving an antitussive just to ask them to try a budesonide inhaler, and that may decrease bronchial hyperreactivity and they actually tend to improve. So this is just an observation that we've had in some patients.
The next question, again continuing on physiotherapy, is if the person is using a spirometer, is there any advice on how frequently he should use it, for what duration he should use it? Should he be trying to inhale more or sustain more? Is there any specific advice on use of those inhaler spirometers?
See, I think first thing is that incentive spirometer has become a household name and it is being sold by bulk. And my personal experience is that 99% of the time people really don't know how to use it. There are two kind of things available, forgetting about the ones available for the kids. One is which has a number thing there where you can know how much is your tidal volume, and the other is with three balls which are three different colors. So normally what you see happening in your wards is that patients are going to just do a knee-jerk kind of reaction and say one ball goes up and the second one goes up and then it comes down. What is required is that sustenance of all the three balls at the maximum possible place, the height, and that is what helps them out. So there are a lot of videos, on the YouTube where I would advise people who buy us, incentive spirometers, see those things and then try to sustain the height of the balls than to have a ball go up and come down, two balls going up and come down. That really doesn't help much. But if you have a sustenance thing, it works. Number of times, well, it is not really, there's no literature which says how many times in a day will work good. But what I think is if a patient is in isolation, if you ask him to do it about for 15 minutes, 3 times a day, it works very well. And they are able to do it. And as the time goes, they are able to do much more of it. And then they feel good about it because then they see the results in front of them.
I have a very specific question here. I don't understand it, therefore I'll just read it out as it has been written here. Is HFNC non-inferior to NIV in preventing post-extubation treatment failure in COPD patients previously intubated for hypercapnic respiratory failure? So I'll have to leave it to one of the extreme specialists to give us an answer to this.
See, the high flow nasal cannula is a device which is just about 5-7 years old, and it had been promoted all over the world as for various things, and it is only with COVID it has come in. If you see a lot of literature coming in for high flow nasal cannula is basically sponsored by the people who gave the device. Your question talks about hypoxic respiratory failure, COPD, post-extubation, while a NIV versus high flow nasal cannula. So if you come to this group of patients, well, I personally won't be aware of a specific database who talks about this, but it has been shown that if you extubate a patient and prophylactically put them on NIV, the rate of re-intubation is less. Similarly, if you extubate a patient, forget about the other reasons. If you extubate a patient and put him on prophylactic high flow nasal cannulas, it is envisaged that it works the same way as an NIV would work. However, this disease, COVID disease per se, has shown us, and we at our place have seen quite a lot of cases, I've repeatedly said that, which have landed up into major problems of pneumomediastinum and pneumothoraxis just because of high flows of high flow nasal cannulas. So we must remember that if you have a diseased lung, then high flow nasal cannulas are not always the best kind of devices to be used. There's somebody else who will want to make a comment.
Dr. Marwa.
Can I add something here, sir? So non-invasive ventilation has been studied for use in established post extubation respiratory failure, and they have failed. So there is a role of prophylactic NIV. That is when you are extubating them and you put them on NIV, then they are found to be useful. Once the respiratory failure is established, then they are of no use. The patient has to be intubated. So in terms of that, the NIV is a better device when it comes to type 2 respiratory failure, whereas for type 1 respiratory failure, HFNC may be tried. So here, if we are looking at type 1 respiratory failure, which is the usual kind of failure with COVID, possibly HFNC can be used. But definitely when it comes to a type 2 respiratory failure in a COPD-like situation, NIV is better.
Right.
What I think is important to keep in mind, because the data is very strong for COPD in terms of using it post extubation and preventing reintubation in these patients. So as a sort of a natural thing to in most patients that you extubate after having, although we now have started intubating less and less because NIV has really changed the whole scenario as far as COPD is concerned and intubation. But those COPD patients who get intubated and are extubated, they should be put on NIV, because then the chance of reintubation become much less.
Yes.
Right, so we've reached about an hour and 45 minutes already. So just take another couple of questions before we close. There's obviously no end to the questions. We'll just take a couple more from the chat box. We've done all in the Q&A. So the next one was a patient who already has a nasogastric or a feeding tube and requires an NIV. Do we need to shift to parenteral feeding?
Okay, Dr. Vimay.
No, Rajiv, one does not need to shift to parenteral feeding at all. Yes, agreed that keeping the NG tube in situ might lead to an improper fit of a interface. But again, if the interface is a helmet, then it really doesn't cause any problem. Some CPAP masks also have an outlet for the NG tube, then it does not cause a problem with the fit. The only problem that you can envisage is the problem with the fitting of the interface, which can lead to leaks and ineffective NIV. But otherwise, there is no indication, if the fit is all right, of shifting the patient to parenteral. Moreover, if the patient is tolerating some periods of the NIV, one can take off the NIV mask, put him on HFNC, and give him something to eat and drink, and shift him back to NIV. So that can also be tried. So parenteral nutrition is not advocated for patients who are on NIV, because first of all, if the patient is fully conscious and is able to protect the airway, then why not give enteral? Enteral is always better than parenteral.
Dr. Bhatia?
Yeah, and not to forget that parenteral feed is associated with a lot of complications.
Right.
So for gut, it is said, use it or lose it.
Right. Dr. Amrusha, yes.
We are actually using an NG tube for a lot of our patients who are NIV. And in fact, it is helping us because every time we remove the NIV to feed our patients enterally, obviously the patient gets hypoxic and is not feeding well. So feeding them through the RTs has been helping us to keep the nutrition, well maintained, as well as it is preventing the hypoxia in patients where we are unable to give them any NIV-free durations. So in fact, we would definitely recommend having an RT in place with a patient on NIV.
Dr. Marwa?
There's a distinct advantage of using the helmets here, sir. Because with the helmet, it is much easier with that interface to feed the patient, because there's a straw which comes through the helmet and you need not remove the interface at the time of feeding.
All right, I'm just going to take one more last question before we close this. And this is a patient who's desaturating on NRBM. Can we add a nasal cannula? Is that something that is recommended, or is that a waste of effort?
No, we have seen it happening so many times in various parts of the country that they have two devices on a patient at the same time, thinking that everything is going to be multiplied. Well, that doesn't really work that way. Otherwise, you could have a nasal cannula, a normal mask, and an NRB over them. No, it doesn't work. So it is advisable to use one device, and then if you think it fails, go to the next level. And that is the way it has to go, from a simple nasal, let's say nasal cannula for 2 liters per minute, and then gradually go up. There are people who practice a nasal cannula below a mask, giving 4 liters from that and 15 liters from here, which will just lead to a lot of wastage of oxygen in today's scenario. So let's go step by step. Let's have a protocol how and when to go, so that we can take care of patients in the best possible way.
Right. Thank you, sir. I'm going to hand over to Professor Guleria for his summarizing comments.
No, thank you very much. And as usual, we've had a tremendous audience and huge number of questions. Many questions we've not been able to take, but we'll try and answer them And like I said yesterday, we'll try and build an FAQ section so that it's useful for not only the mentoring institute, the Center for Excellence, but even it can be percolated down for people who will have these questions as we go to smaller towns and cities. But I think we had a very good session in the beginning for 1 hour, because the ministry wanted this topic to be also highlighted to the general public. It was also transmitted live by Doordarshan, and therefore we took some questions from that side and did have till 4 o'clock some degree of generic questions also. But I think we've really had a lot of doubts clarified as far as oxygen therapy is concerned, what to use, when to use, and when not to use. And I'm grateful to Dr. Vimi Rewari, the professor who in anesthesia, pain, and critical care, for an excellent talk. I'm grateful to my panelists, Dr. Anjan Trikha and Dr. Neeraj Nishchal, for being there to answer the questions. And of course, to all of the faculty who have joined in from various centers across the country for interacting, for taking part, and for being there, and for shouldering the responsibility of taking this further down to other areas, so that we will have a good sort of strategy and good evidence-based management protocols for management of COVID-19 in all areas of the country, even if it's the remotest part. So thank you very much. And tomorrow we will have again a talk which will be on ventilation and ICU management. So as you can see, we're going up as far as the treatment strategies are concerned. And then subsequently, we will have talks on therapies like remdesivir, anti-IL-6 therapy. And I was thinking of adding another topic, and that was the management of blood sugars in patients with COVID-19, because a large number of patients are on steroids, and this is causing a lot of problems in terms of sugar management, both at home, in the hospital, and when patients are discharged from the hospital. So we will also try and put in one extra talk on that. If you have any suggestion that you think some talk needs to be covered or some area needs to be covered, do send a mail so that we'll try and see if we can incorporate that also. We will in the end try and make one comprehensive module of all these topics, and then we can see how they can be sort of rolled out in regional areas. Any suggestions from your side will always be welcome. So thank you very much. And finally, I need to thank Dr. Rajiv Kumar for moderating the whole session and really being the coordinator for everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Tomorrow's webinar, the links will remain the same, both for the panelists and for the audience. Please join in again at about 3 p.m. Same links for everyone. And we are going to try and put up these videos on the AIIMS YouTube channel and also on the AIIMS COVID website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.